Welcome back to another episode of the Ink and Impact podcast. Today, I am joined with Rick McKinney. Rick and Jane have lived an extraordinary life of ministry. Once described as mavericks, they have literally stepped out into the unknown to embrace God's call and have experienced his presence in a way that only comes through a life of obedience. Whether planting and pastoring churches, traveling the world to perform concerts, building a house in Mexico, traveling from village to village in India, or walking across America, they have followed his voice as he led them forward one step at a time. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you. It's so great to join you today.
There's so much that I could ask you based on that bio that you have a very rich life. God has obviously blessed you in many ways. But what we were going to talk about specifically today is the book that you wrote related to that walk across America. The title of the book is called "And So We Walked: The Inspirational Story of a Couple's Walk Across America." Let's just start there. How long ago was that? What led you to walk? What was that all about?
We actually walked in 2006, and the call to walk came in 2005. We were in full-time evangelism at the time. We were traveling all over the world, singing, preaching, teaching in colleges. And I was preaching a series about reclaiming America. And I was using Joshua chapter 1 as a text. And I was in the study one night preparing and reading Joshua chapter 1, and I heard a voice. It was audible to me. I'm not sure if anybody else could have heard it or not, but it was so real to me that I actually turned around to see if someone was in the room with me. And the voice said, "Do you believe that?" I had just read the verse that says, "Every place you put the sole of your foot, you can claim for me." And I said, "Well, of course I believe it. It's in the Bible." And the voice said, "No, do you believe it?" I said, "Yeah, I believe you said that to Joshua." And the voice said, "Do you believe the principle that every place you put the sole of your foot, you can claim?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess I do believe that." And the voice said, "What do you want to claim?" And I said, "Our country." And so that's where it came. It was a message to me at first. I was a little reluctant to share it with my wife because we weren't athletes by any stretch of the imagination. And we had never walked more than a couple miles probably in our life. And over the next few weeks, I kind of gently broke it to her that I thought that's what God was saying. And after a while, she affirmed that. Our pastor affirmed it. And so we began training. And that's how it started. We trained for a year. We walked about 1,500 miles the year before the walk. And then on the walk, we walked almost 2,800 miles.
That's incredible. I love that. It's not a story, it's an actual experience, but I love how God called you. That is just so powerful. So how did you decide where to start the walk and where to end the walk?
Well, we knew we wanted to end in Washington, D.C. because we thought that was very symbolic. As a matter of fact, we ended the walk on the steps of the Supreme Court. We knew we needed to start on the West Coast somewhere. In our research, we found out that several people had walked Route 66. And so Route 66 ends or begins, whichever way you're traveling, at Santa Monica Pier in Los Angeles. And that's where the famous scene in Forrest Gump is, where he's running under that blue arch. That's the exact spot we started walking. Okay. So we walked basically Old 66 from Los Angeles to Oklahoma City. And we walked about 200 miles on the interstate and about 200 miles on railroad tracks that paralleled where Route 66 would have been. And then we walked basically the I-40 corridor on two-lane highways to Bristol, Tennessee, and then up through Virginia and across to Washington, D.C. We wanted to get to Washington, D.C. on July 4th. So we knew how many miles a day we had to walk, where we had to stop, and all that sort of thing. It worked out wonderfully.
That's amazing. So you ended on July 4th. When did you start?
January 1st. So 6 months, 20 miles a day, 6 days a week. We didn't walk on Sunday except January 1st, the first day of the walk.
I could ask questions about that all day, but I won't because I want people to read the book. So let's talk about the book. You did that many years ago. So what led you to write the book now? Because it's a new release. The book became available to the public in May, correct?
Right.
So what was the delay?
Well, it's an interesting story, I think. My wife, Jane, who walked with me every step of the way, I always kid people and tell people that my view never changed because she was always a few steps ahead of me all the way across America. But she is an excellent note taker and journaler. So she kept two journals. One journal was of all the people we met, every
Mm.
name of every person we met from California to Washington, D.C., and what happened when we met them, what the conversation was. The other journal was kind of a logistical log of the walk, the mile markers that we started and ended at. She documented every mile with landmarks because we knew that there would be some people after the walk was over who maybe doubted and said, "Did you really do that? Did you really walk every step of the way?" And so she wanted to make sure that it was documented in a way that we could prove that if that was ever necessary. So I took those two journals about a month after we walked. We went away for a little retreat to kind of rest up and reorganize and figure out what we were going to do next. And I took those two journals and compiled a story. And that was in 2006. In 2007, I had intended to take the book and start trying to make something out of it that was marketable and maybe send it to some publishers, that sort of thing. But I started back to school. I started back to school to work on a master's degree. Well, I took my first class in theology, and I had a wonderful professor named Dan Francis, who also was an author. And I turned my first paper in, and he turned it back to me the next week, and it looked like a can of red paint had exploded all over it. And he said, "I can't grade this." He said, he was nicer than this about it, but he basically said, "You're a terrible writer and you're never going to pass these courses in your master's degree if you don't learn how to write. But if you will let me teach you, I will teach you how to write." And so during that course, I kept turning in papers and he kept turning them back and I kept making corrections. And I think the reason why I delayed the book so long was because when that happened, I thought, you can't write a book. You can't even write a paper for your master's degree. How in the world are you going to write a book? And so I just kind of put it on the back burner. And Dan was a great encouragement to me in my school, in my writing, and taught me so many things. And then after that, I started work on my doctorate degree, which is even a more intensive writing program. I had to write a dissertation. And I actually did my doctoral dissertation on storytelling as a tool for evangelism. And so I learned more about storytelling than I could ever imagine. As a matter of fact, I heard one of your guests a couple of weeks ago say that Jesus told stories. And that was one of the main points of my dissertation, was the fact that Jesus didn't preach sermons, he told stories. And he doesn't necessarily expect us to preach sermons. He expects us to tell our story. And so I learned about storytelling and a lot more about writing. And so when I graduated in 2014, I pulled the book back out and I started looking at it and I thought, oh, I really was a terrible writer. And I really didn't have any business trying to write a book. And so I got kind of discouraged. And over the next couple of years, I'd pick it up and work on it a little bit. Of course, the biggest obstacle is just wondering how in the world, if you put all this work into something, how are you going to get it published? And I kept reading that memoirs were one of the hardest things to get publishers to look at. And so finally, we worked on it the last year, and I said, we're going to self-publish because that's the way to get this story out. It's too good a story to just sit on a bookshelf somewhere in my office. And so we just bit the bullet and did it. And that's why it took so long. But I'm glad we waited because I think God's timing is perfect.
Yes.
And I have so many people who are writing me now, who are reading the book right now and saying, for such a time as this, I read this book. It has spoken to me. It has ministered to me. It has challenged me and encouraged me. And I think, thank you, Lord, for delaying the process to this point so that it is exactly where it should be at exactly the right time.
I agree. Oh, that's powerful. And it's just a testament to the fact that even though we have doubts about our abilities, we can still continue to learn the craft.
Yes, yes.
And then we ultimately have to trust in what the Lord's calling us to do, right? He obviously
Yes.
called you and Jane to walk, but he also planted that seed of the book in your mind too,
Right.
to reach more people. So I love that you were obedient to that as well. I know you and Jane walked the whole route together. Did she participate in the book process as well?
Well, in the fact that I couldn't have written the book without her journals, yes. And of course, all along the way as I was writing, I would run things by her and say, now, is this exactly how this happened? Or what do you remember emotionally at this moment? Because basically what I had were the dry facts that she had written down. And so I wanted to make sure that as I wrote, it was an emotional writing, that the reader could feel like they were walking along with us. I didn't want it to just be a travel log or just a journal of the steps we took. As a matter of fact, in the book, I say what we discovered about halfway through the walk was we thought that the walk was going to be about the steps we took. It turned out to be about the stops we made, the people we talked to, the people who we were able to lead to an experience and a salvation experience with the Lord, the people who were discouraged, who had children in prison, the people who were sick, the people who had wandered away from God. That's really what the walk became about. And so I wanted to make sure as I wrote and kept checking with Jane, is this what we felt? Is this how it was that day? And a lot of the book is about her and the experiences that she had with the Lord. She has I hate to admit this in public, but she has a much deeper walk with the Lord than I do. And she senses the Lord's presence much more readily than I do a lot of times. I tend to be the intellectual, the person who figures it out, who uses reason a lot. She is a person who senses things sometimes when I miss that. And so I wanted to run that by her. So she was very much a part of the process of writing. And I couldn't have done it, obviously, without her. The walk or the book, I would have quit many times along the way. She had lots of physical problems. She had lots of blisters. I had an accident in Arkansas that was supposed to keep me from walking, and all that's in the book. These wonderful stories about God's provision, about God's healing, about the way God moved in our lives and changed us. As a matter of fact, I always tell people, the people who were changed the most by the walk were not the people we met. They were the people who walked. And our lives were transformed and changed because one of the things we prayed before the walk was, God, as we meet people, help us to see them with the eyes of Jesus. And I tell people, don't ever pray that prayer unless you mean it, because if God changes your eyesight to see people the way Jesus sees people, it'll break your heart every day. It will put a concern in your heart that you may not be comfortable with, and it will cause you to do some things that you may not have done otherwise and sacrifice in some ways that you may not have sacrificed before. So it transformed us and changed us in a radical way. We will never be the same after the walk.
Sure. I asked that question because there are some people who write collaboratively, whereas one person will write one section or one chapter and alternate chapters,
Sure.
that kind of thing. So just wanted to let the listeners know that there are multiple ways to go about writing a book.
Absolutely.
And I love that she was, so involved in the process as well. As you were speaking, I was thinking, was it difficult to engage in conversation with random strangers? Was it hard to broach the gospel message with random strangers?
It kind of depended on where we were. We purposely walked through every major city that we could because we wanted to engage with the homeless, with the disenfranchised people that were there, people on the streets. And so those people were very easy to approach. As a matter of fact, the most positive experiences we had on the walk were with people living under bridges, people who were living in back alleys, eating out of garbage cans. Those were the easiest relationships. We never feared for our lives from people. We did fear a few times from dogs. We had been told that dogs would be the greatest problem, and they really were. But God delivered us even in that. And we always approached churches. We stopped at as many churches as we could and just said, hey, is there anything that you would like us to pray for your church? We're walking across America to pray for our country. We got the coldest and most rudest receptions from churches along the path, much more so than we did even people who weren't believers. Many times people would tell us right up front, I'm not a believer. I'm an atheist. I'm an agnostic. I don't believe in God. But they were always civil. They were always nice. They were always interested in hearing our story. But unfortunately, many times the churches weren't. And we had been warned about that, but I didn't believe it. I didn't think it would. We actually had a couple of pastors who just said things like, I wouldn't be interested in talking to you about anything like that. I think they, for whatever reason, they weren't interested. So we shook the dust off our feet, figuratively, and we moved on to people who wanted to hear the message. And that was a lot of people.
I ask that question because I think it ties into marketing our books. because a lot of times, especially as first-time authors, we're very hesitant to promote ourselves. We think it's coming across as us, not just the book, right? But we're
Right.
promoting the message. And God has given us as Christian writers particular messages for a reason, for a purpose, and that is to share it with others. And I think that sometimes there are those certain pockets of population that's harder to market to
Mm-hmm.
than it is others. And so, what have you found with marketing your book? Has that played similarly in that regard?
Well, I don't know that I have enough experience to answer that real thoroughly. I knew when we self-published, I had listened to enough podcasts to know that we were going to have to do a lot of self-marketing. And so we are doing that. We're doing Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Pinterest and all those kinds of things, running a few Facebook ads, not spending a lot of money, but we're trying to get the word out. And I think the reception so far has been real positive. And obviously, I think most of the people that have purchased the book so far have been Christian people, because it's a very Christian message and it's a very overt Christian message. There's nothing secretive about it. As we go forward, though, one of the goals that I have is really trying to move into some different markets, some people who are interested in cross-country walks, some people who are interested in hiking, some people that are interested in those kinds of sports. I'm learning a lot about marketing, more than I ever thought. Most people would never know this about me, but I am a profound introvert. And I understand that most writers are. I've learned to be a functional introvert. Marketing has been a little bit of a challenge for me. But on the walk, I think it changed my demeanor enough to know that walking up to someone and talking to them about eternal things is something that God will empower you to do, even if that's not who you are naturally. Jesus promised that when his disciples were to face those kinds of things and even stand in the courtrooms, that the Holy Spirit would put the right words in their mouth. And we found that to be the case. The divine appointments that God set up for us all across the country were just absolutely amazing. We'd be walking in some place and it was as though they were standing there waiting for us to show up.
Wow.
Construction workers, DHL delivery people, guards of places we were walking through. It was just amazing. And we saw every day how God just set those appointments. If you think about taking steps, if the green light doesn't turn green, if you can't walk across the crosswalk at an exact time, then the person you meet a block down the road wouldn't have been there.
That's true.
And when you think about it in terms of steps, it's amazing how God sets those appointments. And my attitude came to be, if God is willing to set these appointments for me, then I have to be willing to speak to people. And so that's where I came to. And I think I got bolder as the walk went through. Now, my wife, she'll talk to anybody. She'll she'll talk to a brick wall. And my wife talked to people all across the country. As a matter of fact, she led a man to the Lord on the second day of the walk while I just stood there and watched. I was in amazement. I learned a lot from her on the walk about sharing Jesus.
So, throughout the book creation process, how long did it take you to finally decide, okay, I'm going to write this and publish it? How long was that process?
Because most of the writing was done and it was a matter of editing and cleaning it up and changing a few timelines, that sort of thing, probably about 6 months, which is
Okay.
still a pretty good chunk of time. I'm kind of a perfectionist. Again, I think a lot of introverts are. And so I kept reading it and running it through editing programs, and I'd find a little something here and a little something there. And my wife finally said, "You're going to have to go ahead and pull the trigger. You're probably going to find a mistake or two after you publish it, but you're going to have to learn to live with that, because otherwise, if you wait till it's perfect, we'll never get it up."
That's
So
true.
I think that was good advice.
Like you said, no one's perfect and no book is perfect. And that's the nice thing about self-publishing is that you can go back and make corrections later, even after it
Right.
is published. So that is really a selling point for self-publishing. You already shared about why you decided on self-publishing. So how did you decide which service provider to use? Did you just use KDP or did you use a variety of services?
We started with KDP exclusively because since I had never published before, the more I listened to the podcast and the more I understood about going wide and all those kinds of things, I thought, for my first book, I'm 67 years old. And so I thought the learning curve is pretty steep on publishing a book. I think it's a lot to take in. If I was 25 or 30, I'd probably absorb it much quicker. But at my age, it was a lot to take in, a lot to learn. And so I have decided to start narrow at first with KDP. I've been very pleased with the process. Everyone who's received a book has thought that the product itself was really good. But I have explored the possibility of next time. I'm already working on the next book. And so when that book comes out, probably in a year or so, I may choose to go wide and go with more publishers. But so far, I've been very happy.
I love that. I mean, play to your strengths is always a good motto to hold on to, and to start simple. You can always add
Yes.
more things later. And I love that, at 67, which really isn't old in today's time, that you are following the leading of the Holy Spirit and doing the work. A lot of us of any age need that reminder to just do the work, right?
Well, fortunately, I'm a college professor, so I'm around college students all the time, which I
Yeah.
swear keeps you young, and
It's
it
bound
keeps
to.
you up on technology. And so I teach at a college about 25 miles from here, University of the Cumberlands. I teach Old Testament, New Testament, and church history. Every day I come home and I feel young because
That's
I'm
great.
around these students, and I eat lunch with them, and I go to church with them, and we spend a lot of time together. And so I think that's helped. One of the things I found out in the very beginning was I thought that because I could preach and because I could speak in front of 10,000 people, that I could write. And that is a huge misconception, because when you preach, you have facial expressions, you have hand gestures, you have your eye contact, you have your smile, the inflection of your voice. You have all those tools to communicate truth. When you sit down and write with pen and paper, you don't have any of those. And so I mentioned before about wanting to make the book emotionally viable to the reader. And that's what you have to learn to use words for, because you don't have all those other tools. I've read so many books by preachers who were such great preachers and such poor writers because they wrote like they preached, and they don't equate. Some do. Some great preachers were also great writers, but I didn't want to be the guy who somebody said, well, he can preach, but he really can't write. And so there was a lot of learning curve even in that process of saying, okay, if I was speaking this is what I would do. How do I convey that in words? So that's one of the things that I learned along the way.
That's an excellent point, which leads me to my next questions. What lessons have you learned through the writing process? Were there any others that stand out to you?
Again, this could be my age, it could be a lot of different things, but one of the keys was reading and rereading and rereading what I had written. A lot of times we write things down and it makes perfect sense to us. But when we come back a week later and read it, we think, what was I trying to say? The disconnect between what our mind is telling us we want to put on paper and what we actually put on paper, I guess. So for me, one of the big things was you've got to keep going back and rereading and rereading and then rewriting and then letting someone else read. I always tell my students, let somebody else read your papers before you turn them in, because what you thought made sense didn't make sense to me. And so always letting somebody else read. And I have a built-in reader with my wife, but letting her read, and she says, well, I think you could say this differently, or I don't think this conveys. This is what happens in texts. When we text people, there's so much misunderstanding because it's just not there. So you have to learn somehow to convey not just the facts, but you have to convey, especially I think in Christian writing, and this is extremely important, and in memoir writing, you have to be able to convey not just the facts of what happened, but the thought process you were going through, what you were feeling, what other people were feeling as you talked to them, and how they responded and how you responded. And all those things you refine by rereading and rereading and rereading. And that's just one of the things that I've learned. And I'm sure there's a lot more to learn as I write.
Oh, there's always something more to learn for all of us.
Long learner.
So that is another excellent point. And that is why if you are on different podcasts or in different courses, you'll hear all the time about having beta readers. And that's what the whole purpose of having not just one other person, but several people reading in advance of publication,
right,
so that you can catch those things and capture the missing information like that. You've already shared about how God has continued to show things through you through the book process and launching it and so forth. And we're all writing books, hopefully, to make an impact for the Lord. And I was just wondering, have there ever been any books, obviously the Bible, but any other books that have impacted you in some way in your life?
Yeah, there's a whole lot. And I was trying to think through that process before we started the interview and really tried to narrow it down. When I was a teenager, I read a book, a very short book, little paperback book, probably less than 100 pages, called Tell the World, by a man named Arthur Blessed. Arthur Blessed had, and he still has, an extremely impactful ministry. 1969, he started walking across in Los Angeles, California, and also walked to Washington, D.C., different route than we took, but he carried across all the way across the United States with his family. And when he was walking through Cincinnati, Ohio, he actually stayed with my aunt one night. They were staying in people's houses, and he left his baby stroller there, and so he had to go back and get it. I met Arthur several years later, and we have developed a wonderful friendship. He's been to churches I've pastored, and he's just been an awesome inspiration. He has now walked the cross around the world. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest walk of any human being. He's walked in every country and every island group in the world. He's in his 80s now. He still takes the cross out occasionally and walks it with his GoPro, and he's on YouTube and on Facebook and all kinds of things. But this little book called Tell the World was about the importance of sharing Jesus with people. And I think it changed my life. My father was a pastor. I was raised in a Christian home. I made a decision to follow Jesus early in my childhood. But at age 13, everything changed for me. I read that little book. I encountered some pastors who were revolutionary for the time during the Jesus movement, who had long hair. I'd never seen a long-haired preacher before. And I knew God had called me to preach, but I didn't think I could be a preacher because I didn't think I could be square like that. But when I saw a preacher who had long hair preaching and people coming to Jesus, I said, I could be that kind of preacher. And I was for a long time when I still had hair. And so I read that little book about that time, and it lit a fire in me. And I couldn't quit figuring out ways to tell people about Jesus. And a lot of them are silent ways. I used to go out to the interstate highway, make big signs that said, "Smile, God loves you," and "Jesus loves you." And I would hold it up as people got onto the interstate every morning on their way to work. I didn't have to say a word, but it was a way of sharing Jesus with people. And that book changed my life. And Arthur is a dear friend now, and I read all of his books, of which he has many. And he has just been a huge inspiration to me in telling people about Jesus. And also, obviously, walking across America, although the instructions came from God, the inspiration came from Arthur, and knowing that a human could actually do that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that book, many others, but I think that book made a difference.
Oh, that is really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. How can people connect with you, Rick?
Easiest way is through our website, rickandjanemckinney.com. It's loaded with all kinds of material. I write a blog. There are pictures of us in India and China and all the places around the world where we've ministered. There's information about speaking engagements. You can order the books there and sign up for the newsletter. I've learned a lot about all those kinds of things on the podcast here, and reader magnets and all those kinds of things. So it's all there. You sign up for the newsletter list and you'll get a little booklet from me called Demolishing Strongholds.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rick.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.